The Quest for Cosmic Justice by Thomas Sowell. Continued. Cassette 2, Side 1. The very attractiveness of cosmic justice in the close personal relations and mutually felt reciprocal obligations within a family makes it a seductive danger as a government policy of entitlements, implying no reciprocal obligations, in a large impersonal society. The alternative to political crusades and government programs is not that we should do nothing, as it is sometimes thoughtlessly phrased. There has never been a moment in the entire history of the United States when nothing was being done to offset the undeserved misfortunes of the poor and the disadvantaged. Indeed, as Milton Friedman has pointed out, the period of the greatest opposition to the role of government in the economy in the 19th century was also a period of an unprecedented growth of private philanthropy. It was also a period of private social uplift efforts by volunteers all across America. Such efforts, incidentally, had a dramatic effect in reducing crime and other social ills, such as alcoholism, so these were hardly ineffectual gestures. Indeed, they were far more effective than the more massive government-run programs that began in the 1960s. Organized philanthropy and individual efforts to help those born into less fortunate circumstances have been as widespread among those who have opposed political solutions as among those who have promoted them, even if the former have not paraded their compassion as much as the latter. Only when Adam Smith's personal records were opened after his death was it discovered how much of his modest wealth had been given away to help others. Milton Friedman has set up a foundation to promote school vouchers in order to try to rescue children whose parents are too poor to enable them to escape the inferior education they receive in public schools. Numerous other conservative individuals have done similar things, including those whose fortunes went into the Carnegie, Ford, and Rockefeller foundations, where others later changed the focus to promotion of a very different vision from those of the donors. Such plain facts may be surprising to some, only because they do not fit the prevailing vision, however widely or however long they have fit the facts. The question is not whether undeserved misfortunes shall be addressed. The question is whether they will be addressed politically, rather than in the numerous other ways in which they have been, are being, and will be addressed, usually without the high costs, counterproductive results, and dangers to the whole fabric of society that the politicizing of such misfortunes has produced repeatedly in countries around the world. At a minimum, it is necessary to understand the distinction between establishing prospective rules for the behavior of flesh-and-blood human beings toward one another, and trying ad hoc to retrospectively adjust the cosmos to our tastes. Not only does cosmic justice differ from traditional justice and conflict with it, more momentously, cosmic justice is irreconcilable with personal freedom based on the rule of law. Traditional justice can be mass-produced by impersonal prospective rules governing the interactions of flesh-and-blood human beings, but cosmic justice must be handmade by holders of power who impose their own decisions on how these flesh-and-blood individuals should be categorized into abstractions, and how these abstractions should then be forcibly configured to fit the vision of the power holders. Merely the power to select beneficiaries is an enormous power, for it is also the power to select victims, and to reduce both to the role of supplicants of those who hold this power. One of the crucial differences between political and non-political ways of dealing with undeserved misfortunes is that the non-political approaches do not acquire the fatal rigidities of law, nor require either the vision or the reality of helplessness and dependency. Nor does it require the demonization of those who think otherwise, or the polarization of society. Moreover, the amount of help and the circumstances of help can be tailored to the individual circumstances of the recipients in a way that is not possible when the rigidities of law create rights to what others have earned, independent of one's own behavior or the role of that behavior in the misfortunes being suffered. Most important of all, attempts at bettering the lot of society in general, as well as the unfortunate in particular, need not take the form of direct aid at all. Rather, these efforts can more effectively take the form of creating economic and other circumstances in which individuals can themselves find life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Such an approach does not seek to feed the hungry, but to establish conditions in which no one has to be hungry in the first place, circumstances in which there are jobs available for those willing to work. Its emphasis is not on helping those in poverty, but on getting them out of poverty and preventing others from falling into poverty. Economic development has been the most successful of all anti-poverty policies. It was not very long ago, as history is measured, when such things as oranges or cocoa were the luxuries of the rich, and when it was considered an extravagance for the President of the United States to have a bathtub with running water installed in the White House. Within the 20th century, such things as automobiles, telephones, and refrigerators went from being luxuries of the rich to being common among the general population, all within the span of one generation. Material well-being is, of course, not everything. Justice matters as well. But whatever one's vision of a just world, what is crucial is to recognize that 1. Different visions lead to radically different practical policies, that 2. We shall continue to talk past one another so long as we do not recognize that cosmic justice changes the very meaning of the plainest words, and that 3. Whatever we choose to do, it should be based on a clear understanding of the costs and dangers of the actual alternatives, not simply the heady feeling of exultation produced by particular words or visions. Recognizing that many people, through no fault of their own, have windfall losses, while those same people and others also have windfall gains, the time is long overdue to recognize also that taxpayers, through no fault of their own, have been forced to subsidize the moral adventures which exalt self-anointed social philosophers. Victims of violent crimes have been forced to bear even more painful losses from those same moral adventures. There is no question that a world in which cosmic justice prevailed would be a better world than a world limited to traditional justice. However, it is one thing to rail against the fates, but no one should confuse that with a serious critique of existing society, much less a basis for constructing a better one. There is an ancient fable about a dog with a bone in his mouth. He looked down into a pool of water and saw a reflection that looked to him like another dog with another bone, and that other bone seemed to be larger than his bone. Determined to get the other bone instead, the dog opened his mouth and prepared to jump into the water. This, of course, caused his own bone to drop into the water and be lost. Cosmic justice is much like that illusory bone, and it, too, can cause us to lose what is attainable in quest of the unattainable. Chapter 2. The Mirage of Equality. Many a man has cherished for years as his hobby some vague shadow of an idea too meaningless to be positively false. Charles Sanders Peirce. Equality, like justice, is one of the most fateful and undefined words of our times. Whole societies can be and have been jeopardized by the passionate pursuit of this elusive notion. There is nothing wrong with equality in itself. In fact, there is much that is attractive about the idea. At the very least, glaring inequalities are unattractive, even for those who accept them as either inevitable, like death, or as the lesser of alternative evils. But to equate the attractiveness of the concept with a mandate for public policy aimed at equality is to assume that politicizing inequality is free of costs and dangers, when in fact such politicization can have very high costs and very grave dangers. The abstract desirability of equality, like the abstract desirability of immortality, is beside the point when choosing what practical course of action to follow. What matters is what we are prepared to do, to risk, or to sacrifice in pursuit of what can turn out to be a mirage. Processes designed to create greater equality cannot be judged by that goal, but must be examined in terms of the processes created in pursuit of that goal. It is the nature of these processes, including their addictiveness and the never-ending strife they can engender if equality proves to be impossible to achieve, which creates the dangers. In short, the problem is with the mirage, not with the realization of an idea that seems unlikely ever to be realized. Meanings of equality. One of the reasons why equality may be impossible to achieve is that merely defining it opens up a bottomless pit of complications. Numbers may be equal, 2 plus 3 equals 5, because they have only one dimension, magnitude. But equality among multidimensional entities, even inanimate and abstract entities like the gross national product, may be impossible to define, much less achieve, when one nation's GNP includes much more of products A, B, and C, while another nation's GNP includes much more of products X, Y, and Z. Only by finding some common denominator that can be applied to these disparate assortments is it possible to say which country has the higher total GNP, and even then this common denominator may be so arbitrary that it cannot command the acquiescence of those whose definition is different, and who therefore cannot regard equality as defined by this arbitrary standard as being anything other than inequality by the standard they prefer. In the case of determining which country has a higher gross national product, the first country may have a higher GNP if the common denominator is the price of goods as measured by using official exchange rates, while the second country may have a higher GNP if the test is which country could actually purchase all of the other countries' GNP in the international marketplace and still have something left over. By the first criterion, Japan has a higher per capita output than the United States, but by the second criterion, the United States has a 25% higher per capita output than Japan. Since human beings are even more multidimensional, defining equality among them becomes even more problematical and ultimately arbitrary, quite aside from the subsequent difficulties of achieving whatever equality might be defined. Economic equality, for example, may be achievable only by political measures which require vast concentrations of power in a relatively few hands in government, and even this momentous exchange of economic inequality for political inequality may leave untouched the vast spectrum of other inequalities in intelligence, talent, physical appearance, charm, articulation, etc., which may have more influence on many individuals' prospects of happiness than the economic inequalities that have been addressed at such high cost. However, since economic inequalities are a central focus of those seeking a more egalitarian society, it may be useful to explore some of the difficulties in merely defining and determining how much economic inequality exists already, quite aside from the costs and dangers in trying to change the economic system in some fundamental way in hopes of more egalitarian results. Economic equality and inequality. Ironically, economic inequalities, which are widely regarded as far more serious than inequalities in sports, for example, are far less well documented or even well defined. It has long been a common practice in sports statistics to follow the same individual over a period of years, but this is a relatively new departure in statistics on income inequalities. Even now, most of the statistics that are thrown around concerning the rich and the poor are aggregate statistics about income strata as of a given moment, even though most Americans do not stay in the same quintile of the income distribution for as long as a decade. Given this transience of membership in the various income brackets, it is possible to understand some otherwise puzzling statistics on the lifestyles of the poor. People in the bottom quintile of the income distribution spend nearly $2 for every dollar of income they receive, 2/3 of the statistically defined poor have air conditioning, and more than half own a car or truck. More than 1/4 of the poor own 2 cars and/or trucks, and hundreds of thousands of them own homes costing more than $150,000. Puzzling as such anomalies might seem if we were discussing an enduring class of genuinely poor people, they are understandable in a statistical category which includes many transients. In any given year, many entrepreneurs may be earning not only low incomes but negative incomes as their businesses incur losses. Professionals, entertainers, and others may also suffer off years that leave them in the bottom 20% for that year. Many members of high school and college graduating classes enter the labor force in the middle of the year, earning only about half of what they will normally be earning when they work the entire year. Unless they find very high-paying jobs, their half-year earnings may well leave them statistically among the poor. Middle-class or wealthy people are unlikely to divest themselves of all the accoutrements of their lifestyle just because they are having an off year, especially when they have financial resources and/or credit that will see them through till their situation improves again. In short, many of those in the bottom 20% of the income distribution are not poor in any meaningful sense and do not live like people who expect to remain there. Since only 3% of the American population remains in the bottom quintile for as long as 8 years, it is hardly surprising that so many of those who are defined as being in poverty as of any given year do not act as if they are. In contrast to the carefulness with which sports statistics are kept, most statistics about the poor totally ignore their financial assets. Thus, someone with $1 million in the bank, or who owns property worth several million, will be counted among the poor during off years in his business or profession, when his revenues for a particular year barely exceed his costs for that particular year, or when his net income for that year may be negative. Politically or ideologically, of course, incentives are to maximize the number of people who can be counted as poor, in justification of movements or policies ostensibly aimed at reducing poverty. The radically different picture produced by following actual flesh and blood human beings over time, as distinguished from looking at statistics for a given moment in time, applies not only to the poor but also to the rich. The typical Hollywood movie version of the rich, someone born in a mansion, heir to a fortune, educated in snooty private schools and Ivy League colleges, bears little resemblance to actual millionaires studied in the 1990s, or in the 1890s for that matter. A 1996 study found that 4/5 of all the American millionaires studied earned their fortunes within their own lifetimes. So did an 1892 study. The social origins of a group of individuals with net worths of $10 million each or more was inadvertently revealed at a gathering sponsored by a financial organization where exquisite food and drink had been prepared for a group more like the Hollywood millionaire or the rich of political rhetoric. To make sure our decamillionaire respondents felt comfortable during the interview, we rented a posh penthouse on Manhattan's fashionable East Side. We also hired 2 gourmet food designers. They put together a menu of 4 pâtés and 3 kinds of caviar. To accompany this, the designers suggested a case of high-quality 1970 Bordeaux, plus a case of a wonderful 1973 Cabernet Sauvignon. During the subsequent 2-hour interview, the 9 decamillionaire respondents shifted constantly in their chairs. Occasionally, they glanced at the buffet, but not one touched the pâté or drank our vintage wines. We knew they were hungry, but all they ate were the gourmet crackers. These multimillionaires were clearly in an unfamiliar setting, based on a lifestyle very different from the way they actually lived. Unlike Hollywood movie millionaires, most American millionaires do not have a lavish lifestyle. The average cost of their automobiles, $24,800, is only a few $1,000s more than that of the average American's automobile, and is well below the cost of such luxury cars as the Cadillac or Lexus. Twice as many American millionaires have a Sears credit card as have a credit card from Neiman Marcus. Most have never paid as much as $400 for a suit. For every millionaire who buys a $1,000 suit, 6 or more non-millionaires buy one. In short, neither the rich nor the poor match the classic picture of a class into which people are born, live, and die, and in which they maintain a lifestyle born of that permanence. The persistently rich and persistently poor, put together, are not a major segment of the American population, though political issues are often framed as if they were. As already noted, only 3% of Americans remain in the bottom 20% for as long as 8 years. Only 3.5% of the American population have a net worth of $1 million or more, even though net worth literally includes the kitchen sink, as well as other household assets, clothing, pension fund equity, and other assets that could not be turned into ready cash. Nevertheless, even with this generous definition, both the rich and the poor, put together, add up to less than 7% of the American population. Nevertheless, great political and ideological battles are often fought as if these were the central groups in the society, rather than the other 93% who are in no meaningful sense either rich or poor. A major factor in both income and wealth is age. Those who have worked for many years tend to have advanced in their careers to higher-paying positions and to have accumulated more assets, whether in the form of money in the bank or a pension fund or equity in their homes. People in their 60s have persistently had higher incomes than people in their 20s and much higher net worths. In short, membership in various income brackets tends to be transient, in the American economy at least, due both to age and to the ordinary ups and downs of individuals' careers and of the surrounding economy. Yet that fact has had very little effect on visions, crusades, or the rhetoric attacking inequality. Equality and inequality of performance. Thus far, in speaking of equality among human beings, we have mentioned only equality of benefits. But most benefits must be produced, and another dimension of equality is equality of productivity or performance. Egalitarians are offended if any race, gender, or other social groupings are said to be inferior in productivity or performance, especially if it is claimed that they are innately so. But merely defining a performance uniquely can be virtually impossible, even in a narrow field. To deliberately choose an example with no ideological overtones to confuse the issue, Ty Cobb's lifetime batting average was 25 points higher than Babe Ruth's, but Ruth hit far more home runs. To arrive at some common denominator in which to compare their batting performances, you must make some ultimately arbitrary determination as to how many singles are the equivalent of how many home runs. And all this quite aside from differences between Cobb and Ruth as outfielders or base runners, or the fact that Ruth was one of the top pitchers in baseball during his early career. Note again that all these complications arise merely in defining equality of performance in one aspect of a narrow specialty like professional baseball. We have not even begun to address the question as to how other ball players might be made equal in performance to either Cobb or Ruth, much less what equality of performance would mean when comparing performances across a vast spectrum of fields of endeavor. One of the things that makes sports fascinating to so many people are the endless debates as to who was the greatest in a particular sport, or even in a particular specialty within a given sport. The greatest quarterback, shortstop, welterweight, center, goalie, etc. These debates are never resolved precisely because there is no common denominator, even when the facts are extensively documented, beyond dispute, and widely available. The Baseball Encyclopedia, for example, contains nearly 3,000 pages of detailed statistics printed in small type and covering every player in the history of Major League Baseball. Yet the debates rage on because defining equality and its corollaries, superiority and inferiority, is ultimately a conceptual rather than an empirical dilemma. To question equality, whether in concept or in policy application, is not to advocate inequality. The conceptual difficulties in defining who is equal apply as well to defining who is superior and who is inferior. These difficulties are not insurmountable, but they do require some further specifications, and these specifications must ultimately be arbitrary. Some of these difficulties are apparent when we turn to concrete examples involving equality or inequalities of income and wealth, equality or inequalities of performance, equality or inequalities of merit, all at the individual level. Difficulties also arise when considering group equality or inequalities as regards either minority groups within a given society, or cultural equality or inequality as regards one society or civilization compared to another. Culture versus equality. At all stages of history, vast disparities in performance have been commonplace among peoples, nations, regions, and many other groupings of human beings. These disparities have been economic, military, technological, and so on, across a vast spectrum of human differences. Races have been just one of the many groupings which have differed in performance, but these differences have been equally profound among other groupings which have no genetic basis. Moreover, races which have clearly been far more technologically or organizationally advanced than others at one stage of history have been equally far behind those other races in another. China, for example, was far more advanced than any nation in Europe in many technological and organizational ways for many centuries. Yet for the past several centuries, the roles of China and Europe have been reversed. Even within Europe, for most of the recorded history of the continent, southern Europeans have been more advanced than those of the north. Greece had Plato and Aristotle, the Acropolis, and the Colossus at Rhodes, at a time when much of northern Europe consisted of illiterate tribal societies living primitive lives. Yet the technological, economic, and scientific frontier of Europe has for the past few centuries been its northern and western nations. Clearly, the question as to whether there have been large performance differences between peoples as of a given time is quite different from the question as to whether those differences are racial or genetic in origin. Even so, resistance to acknowledging superior performances has in recent times been fierce, determined, and ingenious, even if not always ingenuous. The most sweeping denials of performance superiority have been based on redefining them out of existence as culturally biased perceptions and stereotypes. Those who take this approach of cultural relativism acknowledge only differences, but no superiority. Yet all cultures serve practical purposes, as well as being symbolic and emotional, and they serve these practical purposes more efficiently or less efficiently, not just in the opinions of particular observers, but more importantly, in the practices of the societies themselves, which borrow from other cultures and discard their own ways of doing particular things. Western civilization, for example, has abandoned Roman numerals for mathematical work in favor of a very different numbering system originating in India and conveyed to the West by Arabs. The West has also abandoned scrolls in favor of paper and scribes in favor of printing, in each case choosing things originating in China over things indigenous to Western culture. All over the world, peoples have abandoned their own bows and arrows for guns wherever they have had a choice. Much of the story of the advancement of the human race has been a story of massive cultural borrowings, which have created a modern world technology as much at home in Japan as in Europe or the United States. Whatever the theories of cultural relativists, the actual practices of human beings in virtually all cultures throughout history contradict the notion that it is just a matter of perceptions. These practices of human beings across the planet and down through history the preferences revealed by cultural borrowing, provide a common denominator in which particular products of many cultures can be compared. In this common scheme of valuation, it is clear that some economies, for example, perform much better than others. Nor is this merely a culture-bound perception. Many Japanese products find numerous buyers in societies culturally very different from that of Japan. Within societies as between societies, equality of performance is not to be found. As the distinguished French historian Fernand Braudel put it, "In no society have all regions and all parts of the population developed equally." Performance equality is the most difficult of all kinds of equality to believe in, on any basis other than sheer dogma. The same man is not even equal to himself on different days, much less at different periods of life. However, denials and evasions of performance differences take many forms. A vast literature and powerful legal and political doctrines in many countries proclaim intergroup disparities in representation or rewards to be inequities due either to overt discrimination or to subconscious bias by individuals, institutions, or society. Virtually no one has seriously denied that discrimination and bias have resulted in various inequalities. It is the converse proposition that discrimination or bias can be inferred from statistical inequalities, which is the reigning non sequitur of our times, both intellectually and politically. To prove statistically that the observed patterns of representation or reward are not due to random chance is considered to be virtual proof that they are due to discrimination, not to performance differences. The implicit assumption is that a more or less even or random representation or reward for performance could be expected in the absence of institutional or societal policies and practices which disadvantage one group compared to others. Yet there has never been an even or random world, even in matters not controlled by the biases of others. Not only performance differences, but also differences in luck and in many other factors, wholly disrupt the simple picture of an even, regular, or balanced world. In the case of many social disparities, the beneficiaries have often been powerless minorities with no way to discriminate against the majority populations of their respective countries. The history of the Jews in Eastern Europe, the overseas Chinese in Southeast Asia, the Lebanese in West Africa, and immigrants from India in Fiji are just some of the examples. Innumerable factors are behind these disparities, including not only performance differences, but also differences in median age, often differing by a decade or more from one racial or ethnic group to another, differences in regional distribution, and other differences that may be obvious, speculative, or unknown. What is wholly unsubstantiated is the prevailing assumption that the world would be random or even in the absence of discrimination or bias by individuals, institutions, or society. The factors operating against performance equality are far too numerous, beginning with the physical settings in which different peoples have evolved culturally and economically. Geography is not egalitarian. The very ground that people stand on differs radically in fertility, topography, mineral wealth, and other characteristics. Navigable waterways are abundant in Western Europe and painfully scarce in sub-Saharan Africa. Large beasts of burden, such as horses and oxen, which for centuries played vital roles in the economic life of many parts of the world, were totally lacking in the entire Western Hemisphere before Columbus arrived. It is not uncommon for rainfall on one side of a mountain range to be 10 times what it is on the other side, making for radically different agricultural prospects for the people in the two regions. Geography is brutally oblivious to human desires for equality. It is not simply that economic levels vary widely for different regions of the earth as a result of fortuitous geographical differences. More fundamentally, the people themselves vary in their cultural development according to whether their respective geographical settings facilitate or impede their economic development and their exposure to a wider world of economic and cultural interactions. How could Eskimos have acquired the skills and experience needed to grow pineapples or other tropical crops? How could the peoples of the Himalayas have learned to navigate on the high seas? How would Scandinavians or Polynesians know as much about camels as the Bedouins of the Sahara, or the Bedouins know as much about fishing as the Scandinavians or Polynesians? Given that the mineral deposits that were central to the Industrial Revolution neither existed in the Balkans nor could have been transported there without prohibitive costs, how could immigrants from the Balkans have brought with them to North America or to Australia the industrial skills possessed by people from the mineral-rich industrial heartlands of Germany or Britain? People living on isolated islands in the sea, in remote mountain communities, or in other geographical settings that limit their cultural exposures, tend generally to lag behind the technological, organizational, and other developments among people more favorably situated. When the Spaniards invaded the Canary Islands in the 15th century, they found people of a Caucasian race living at a Stone Age level. So were the Australian Aborigines when the British encountered them. Around the world, according to Brodell, mountains remain almost always on the fringe of the great waves of civilization, for civilizations are an urban and lowland achievement. Cities have long been in the vanguard of human advancement all around the world and over centuries of history. But cities do not arise equally in all geographic settings. In the millennia before the railroad appeared, most cities arose on navigable waterways. Such waterways are vastly more common in Western Europe than in sub-Saharan Africa, and so are cities. Differences in location mean that the sun beats down on different parts of the world with different intensity, making for profound differences in climate, and therefore in agriculture and diseases. The availability of water for drinking, farming, or transportation likewise differs radically across the planet, and even when two regions are both served by rivers, the contrast between those rivers can affect the economic viability of the regions they serve and the cultural development of the peoples within those regions. While rivers in Western Europe may be flowing year-round, rivers in Russia may be frozen for months at a time, and rivers in Africa may be navigable for only limited stretches due to cascades and waterfalls, not to mention drastic seasonal changes in rainfall. It would be miraculous if all these and many other geographical variables worked out in such a way that each group's evolution in its particular physical setting produced the same levels of skills in the same fields of endeavor as that of other peoples elsewhere, even during a given era, much less over the centuries and millennia of human history. Such geographically influenced disparities as of a given time often persist over time, even when peoples move from one geographical setting to another, taking with them a particular set of skills and a whole mental universe, transplanting it into a different setting, where they compete with indigenous people and with others transplanted from other settings that produced different skills and different cultures. Scottish Highlanders long differed culturally from Scottish Lowlanders, not only in Scotland itself, but also in the United States and Australia, where the Lowlanders were far more economically successful, as they were in Scotland. Similar disparities have marked the respective histories of German Jews versus Eastern European Jews, or of Gujaratis versus Tamils from India, among others. Even putting aside all the differences growing out of geographical origins and their cultural consequences, demographic differences alone operate powerfully against equality of performance. No one expects small children to perform as well as adults with decades of education and experience, and groups differ significantly in the respective proportions of their populations which consist of children and which consist of those who are middle-aged adults. Moreover, such intergroup differences in demographic characteristics are common in societies around the world. In the United States, for example, the median age of Jews is decades older than the median age of Puerto Ricans. Even if Puerto Ricans and Jews were identical in every other respect, they would still not be equally represented, in proportion to their respective populations, in jobs requiring long years of experience, or in homes for the elderly, or in activities associated with youth, such as sports or crime. The point here is not to claim that age alone explains most income or wealth differences. The point is that age differences alone are enough to preclude the equality that is presumed to exist in the absence of discrimination. Many other factors also make that vision an impossible one. Despite the ease with which some discussions of income glide from the statistical category of inequality to the moral category of inequity, there is nothing requiring either special explanation or special justification in the fact that a young man beginning his career in his 20s is unlikely to be earning as much as his father in his 40s, who has decades more experience, as well as more time in which to build a reputation. Since the father is also likely to have heavier financial responsibilities for sending children through college or preparing for his own retirement and the growing medical expenses associated with age, statistical differences in income do not necessarily reflect corresponding differences in economic well-being. The son may even be able to afford some amenities or luxuries which his father cannot afford on a higher income. Within given families, there are performance differences on mental tests as between the firstborn child and later children. A study of National Merit Scholarship finalists separated out the firstborn from the later siblings and discovered that more than half of these finalists were firstborns, even in 5-child families. A later study showed that IQ differences among siblings translated into income differences between them of a magnitude comparable to those between unrelated individuals with different IQs. If you cannot achieve equality of performance among people born to the same parents and raised under the same roof, how realistic is it to expect to achieve it across broader and deeper social divisions? The mere fact that families differ in size adds to statistical inequalities. Statistics on how the income of the top fifth of families compares with the income of the bottom fifth are misleading when they do not take into account that the top fifth of families contains more people than the bottom fifth. Families and households have differed in size from one era to another, from one group to another, and from one income bracket to another. For example, there are more than 50% more people per household earning $75,000 and up, as per household earning under $15,000. That is one of the reasons for their differences in income. People earn money, and more people tend to earn more money. There are more than twice as many income earners per household in households earning $75,000 and up, as per household earning under $15,000. The top 20% of income-earning families supply 29% of all workers who work 50 weeks or more per year, while the bottom 20% supply just 7% of such workers. There are very mundane explanations for many of the statistical differences that some seek to explain in more sinister and melodramatic terms. Some people have claimed that groups also differ genetically in their intellectual potential. Rather than sink into this quagmire of analytical complications and emotional cross-currents, we may say simply, we have no need of that hypothesis. That is, even if every group, or even every individual, had the same genetic potential, along with equal geographical backgrounds and equal cultural developments, differences in demographic characteristics alone would still make equality of performance virtually impossible. When demographic differences are instead added to other differences, the probability of equality of performance approaches the vanishing point. In addition, there are other reasons for doubting genetic explanations of intergroup differences. Here, however, it is sufficient to say that we have no need of that hypothesis. Economic consequences of equality. Thus far, we have considered a few of the innumerable causes of inequality. We need to consider also some of the consequences of the concept of equality itself, especially where it is a pervasive and often passionate ideology applied to the real world. Among these consequences are difficulties in providing incentives for people to do their best work, and dangers of even greater inequalities, both economic and political, as a result of trying to apply the vision of equality to the real world. This book is continued at this point on the other side of this cassette. Please reverse or turn the cassette over now.